On the morning of January 15th, 1947, in a quiet lot in South Central Los Angeles, an ordinary housewife out for a walk discovered something that would shock the world. A young actress, stripped, bisected, drained of blood. It is the crime that became the legend of the Black Dahlia murder.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor. Here's your host, Emmy award-winning journalist, Joel Waldman.
Tonight, we bring you an exclusive conversation with Eli Frankel, who I'll bring in just a moment. He has a new book out. It is called Sisters in Death, and this is a book I highly recommend that you read. We'll have a link to it in our comment section, and it digs deeper than just about any other book on this famous case, linking that brutal murder to another unsolved killing of a prairie heiress, uncovering never seen documents and confronting the mystery every investigator calls the key question, which is what really happened that morning? Why did the killer display the body so publicly? And could the same man have committed two cold case murders separated by years and states? And the man who's got the answer to that, my friend, a TV news producer, documentarian, and now author, Eli Frankel. Eli, thank you for joining us. The first and most obvious question, I mean, there is some synergy here, but how do you go from this successful TV producer to writing a book about, what is arguably the most famous cold case in the world?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. It's great to be here. Yeah, I mean, I had been a TV producer, reality shows, game shows, late night, and documentaries for many, many years. I guess, that was my life. I never planned on necessarily writing a book, but I've been a true crime fanatic all these decades, as I'm sure many of your viewers are. I love to deep dive, and after the kids are asleep, my last 2 or 3 hours of each night are diving into different cases. And one of my big obsessions, as it is for many people, is the Manson family. And I turned that into, I created and executive produced the documentary series Helter Skelter for MGM Epics. And through that process, I started, the Black Dahlia had always been like a major, subject of interest for me. But then around 2018, 2019, I kind of took what was essentially a hobby and started really deep diving, getting a hold of all kinds of documents from LA city government and other kind of sundry sources, and started diving in. And, with the project, I initially started with wanting to learn everything I could, not about who the potential killer was, but who the victim was, Elizabeth Short, because I felt like so little had really been written about her. And to me, I wanted to gather together every scrap of everything she had ever said, sent anybody, the testimony of other people who knew her, to learn who she was, and use that also to get to know her, to understand her as a person. I think to honor and respect her as well, because in many ways she is the most maligned victim in true crime history, or one of them. There have been so many mistruths and distortions about her. But what I wanted to do was to also begin to unlock all these mysteries that had sort of never been figured out about the last months, weeks, and days of her life, and use her own words, her own behavior patterns, and her own goals and intentions to begin to unlock those mysteries. And it led to a lot of really big revelations that I think are going to shake this case up.
Yeah, I mean, let's take a half step back. A lot of people, as big a case, cold case as this is, many people have never heard of it. They might be of a younger generation. I mean, this goes back to 1947. Just sort of lay the groundwork. What is this case about? It happened back in 1947. What happened on that fateful day?
Yeah. Well, by the way, one of the interesting things about the Black Dahlia, I've been studying not only the case, but the story around the case, and how every successive generation has sort of picked up the story and carried it, and in different ways. And what's fascinating is that the legend of this murder, even though it's, nearly 80 years ago, just grows and grows with every successive generation. And Gen Z seems to be the most kind of intense about this case than anybody else. The social media posts run into the thousands, the YouTube videos, the podcasts, and it's really driven by people in their 20s and 30s.
Wow, why do you think that is? That's strange to me or
So
odd.
that hits at the heart of the one question about this case I really can't answer. And it's one that I always think about, which is, why are we obsessed with this thing? What
Mm.
is it about this one specific murder that seems to grow every decade in interest and fuels all this speculation? And there's myriad reasons you can point to, like, oh, it's Hollywood in the 1940s, and behind the scenes of the underbelly of Hollywood, and who was the mystery of Elizabeth Short? Or was it the way her body was severed and drained of blood, and the conditions, the way the body was found? Is it the name, the Black Dahlia, that's so intriguing? And yeah, all those elements are obviously crucial to the massive interest in the case. But at the end of the day, you can find myriad other examples of just as horrific murders, many
Mm.
cases with exotic, interesting names that pull you in. Unfortunately, many murders in Hollywood in the 1940s, the dark noir Hollywood scene. I mean, there's something about I think the totality of all those elements, along with the enigma within the mystery, putting the pieces together and trying to figure out the solution to this thing that drives people. But there seems to also be some other element that we just can't put our finger on it. And it may reflect kind of the truth about the darkest recesses of the human mind, that we recognize something primitive within us. I don't know, but it's really interesting to see how the case just continues to grow in interest.
Yeah, I think that, one of the other cases that you might be able to compare this to, is like Jack the Ripper, where they thought they had solved that case not long ago, which goes back to the 1800s. But here, I think it is the allure of Hollywood. There was an actress. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the name Black Dahlia stuck because there was a noir film. Was it Blue Dahlia? There was a film at the time
Yeah.
with a similar name, and that's how this name stuck. I think there's something, sort of eye catching,
Yeah.
obviously about the name that draws people in. But again, just it's such a horrific case. This woman, Elizabeth Short, she's drained of her blood. It's the word is exsanguination, which I
Right.
learned during this research of this interview here. But her blood is literally drained, and I read that maybe she had some of that blood drained while she was still alive, but then her body is like surgically bisected, right?
Yeah.
Literally cut in half. So tell us some of these details. When this housewife walks by with and that was a different era, obviously, with her child. I mean, what exactly does she find?
Right. So for the longest time, everybody thought that the story was essentially consistent, since the police told us that story and reporters told us that story in January of 1947. The case begins with a 26-year-old pretty blonde housewife walking down the street, pushing a stroller with her 3-year-old daughter, Anne, in it, when they happen upon a 2-block stretch of weed strewn lot. Everything else is built up around it, but these 2 blocks are totally empty except for trash and tall weeds which have grown up there. And this is what every telling of the Black Dahlia story begins with. I mean, literally every podcast, every book, every article starts with this very kind of pleasant scene of this woman with her, stroller, and her toddler with her, and then she's walking down the street and she turns to her right, and there she sees the severed, horribly mutilated, tortured form of Elizabeth Short in full display, the two halves of the body separated by a gap of 14 to 18 inches, but laid out very cleanly, symmetrically, and face up, where you can see the entire map of torture and horror that was visited upon her. And then there's two versions. She either runs away screaming to the nearest house and calls the police, or she thinks it's a mannequin and
Mm.
walks on and calls the police to warn them that kids might be frightened. Nonetheless, like, the two versions of that story pretty much tell the same thing. So there was something about that that bothered me. which was, because everybody's heard that story forever. It really grips you. It's an amazing scene that is sort of haunting. And then, it kicks off this investigation that becomes the biggest manhunt in Los Angeles history. And this legendary case, as the police and hundreds of reporters, and then subsequently, writers and researchers over the decades delve into the mystery of who this woman was, where she was at specific points, why she left for San Diego a month before her murder, and then returned to her Los Angeles. And then, of course, who was it that killed her? Whose hands did she fall into on the night of January 9th, 6 days before, when she disappeared? So, it's this really big enigma, and everybody wants to figure out what are the clues, how do we get there, and how does that lead us to the last man she was with? So, the thing though that bothered me about the case was that, or about the story of the way she was found, is that if you look at the photographs online of what Bersinger purportedly saw and was laid out, it's horrible. Like, it is the worst torture, the worst mutilation, the worst suffering that a victim could go through. And the body is it has pieces of flesh ripped out of it. There's weird markings. There's pieces of the body that are missing. And again, of course, the most shocking thing is that it's cleanly severed. Like, a surgeon has cut through the body absolutely cleanly in one line, and it's separated there with the organs still inside. But the thing that I kept kind of bumping on was Betty Bersinger didn't see the body until 10:50 a.m., which is kind of crazy because you have this entire morning where nobody sees anything. And this wasn't like some remote outpost in Los Angeles or some neighborhood that, hasn't been built yet and people aren't around. This is a heavily trafficked artery. There's a streetcar stop half a block away that's depositing hundreds of commuters that are going to stores and shops and businesses to their jobs in that neighborhood. People walk up and down those blocks throughout the morning. And in fact, there were witnesses that said that as late as 8:30 a.m., they walked by that exact spot and didn't see anything.
So, I mean, is the obvious implication that the body was put there sometime, I guess, after 8:30?
No, because there was, first of all, police were able to determine from conditions there in the grass and other aspects that her body was deposited around 6:30 a.m. And a witness at the house down the street, a guy named Bob Myers, who at 6:30 saw a black car pull up to that exact location and get out for about 3 to 4 minutes. The guy got out for about 3 to 4 minutes and then returned to the car and sped off. So, I think people are pretty much, have settled that was the moment that her body was deposited at 6:30. So,
I mean, this is pre-cell phone, so people ostensibly are not walking around with their phones in their nose. Why do you think it was missed?
well, that was my big question. And I really wanted to find out the truth because it's such an important part of the story. It's not just the intro. It tells us so much about the mindset of this killer. And the thing is that there have been this rogues gallery of exotic supervillains, including Orson Welles and, for some reason, Woody Guthrie and some other well-known people, and then some other suspects that are easy to find online. People have always speculated about it. But there's one commonality to all these suspects, which is there's sort of these secret geniuses who are working perfectly to, in total synchronization with all their efforts to shock the world, to show the world their power, their greatness, and to show them what they've done, and then to instill panic and fear in the city of Los Angeles, right? It's like every villain from every, comic book movie is some people just want to see the world burn. This is it. This is who this guy is. And we have to understand the killer through that lens. But it still didn't make sense. How did she see the body, but nobody else did?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I
Let,
tr-
let, let me take another quarter step back before we move forward. I assume that Betty Bersinger is no longer with us because she would have been born in like 1927. I think you said the daughter she was strolling along was named Anne, unless I screwed that up. But is she still alive? Do you know?
She sure is. And I spoke with her, and I also spoke with her mother, who was born in 1921.
Mm.
And And so I thought, God, I don't know if she's still alive. She had essentially disappeared pretty much after the case. She didn't want any notoriety, any attention whatsoever. She did a couple interviews with people later in her life, but she essentially repeated what she had said to the press in 1947. And the police pretty much put her out of reach of the press very quickly. They kind of figured, listen, you don't need to talk to her. She already gave her report. We're good. So Betty wasn't really a huge part of the story. But I wanted to know, the answer to this big question, which just seems so obvious to me. And I was able to track down her daughter, Anne, who is obviously much older now. She was 3 years old at the time. She doesn't remember this incident. But what was incredible was her mother was still alive. And this is in 2000, I forget exactly what year. I think 2021 or 22.
Wow.
She told me, I can get you in touch with her. If you want to ask these questions to her, let's do it.
Wow.
And this was about 6 months before Betty Bersinger died. So it was pretty fortuitous that I got the opportunity to speak with her. And I started asking her questions, and she responded with all the kind of pat rote answers that we've always heard before. And by the way, her mind was totally clear. She was, she hadn't missed a beat.
Was she still living in LA? I'm curious.
No, she was in a different part of California.
Okay.
I don't think they want me saying where it was, but where she was living.
Would she still, all these years later, 80 years later, she's still traumatized by this?
Not at all. That's the amazing thing. I asked Anne, I said, there's so many reports, and in the movie, the Black Dahlia, the Brian De Palma movie, you see the woman running away screaming. And I love her response. She said, I don't think my mother has freaked out and screamed once in her life. It's just not in her character. Betty Bersinger was very self-possessed and in control, and that's not her style. So here's the thing, though, because I found out the truth that she had never told anybody before. I kept pressing her on how is it that you saw the body and nobody else did? I mean, it was right there in front of you on the sidewalk. And she told me it wasn't right there in front of me, right next to the sidewalk. It actually was 12 to 14 feet away from the sidewalk in the weeds. It was hidden. And the only reason I saw it is because I was walking by and I happened to look in the exact right place to my right. And I just saw this white form. And it was very odd. It was so stark white in the sun. And so I walked in to the weeds. She walks 14 feet forward, and there she sees the top half, the top torso of Elizabeth Short's body, but she's facing down. She's not facing up. And so all she's seeing is the back, which is one of the only places on her body that really wasn't mutilated, except for like the lower legs and feet. But she sees the top half and it's face down. So she thinks it's a mannequin, but it's hidden in the weeds. And the weeds are a lot taller, 10 feet into this thing. So the grass is a little bit shorter next to the sidewalk. So she leaves, she takes her daughter down the street. She starts thinking, this mannequin, kids might be afraid. She saw kids bicycling around, which again, by the way, kids on their bicycles that morning in the neighborhood. How did they not see this thing? Right there in front of you by the street, face up. It's this horrible form. You can see it in the photographs, and yet nobody said a thing. And so she's telling me that essentially the body was hidden. It was thrown away in the weeds. And to me, in many ways, that is actually a little more scary than a killer who is displaying his work. He threw her away like trash. He was essentially hiding the remains, the detritus of what he had done to her over the last 6 days, which comports with nearly every serial killer in history. Once they're done with their victims, they don't display them. They don't prop them up. That's really in the movies. What they do is they discard them like trash because that's what they mean to them. And the book also goes on to explain why then do the two halves of the body appear by the sidewalk by the time the press got there 20 minutes later. So it's a really interesting saga, and it completely blows open the case and forces us to kind of re-envision the mindset behind this murder. This is not a person who's looking to shock the world. It's a person who works in the dark, What they did is between them and their victim, and they're hoping you don't find the results of their work. They throw it away like trash in a weed-strewn lot.
Yeah, which obviously explains, I guess, why a lot of people did not see this, and, Betty explaining to you, and it's hard to believe that Eli Frankel spoke to this then housewife strolling her 3-year-old and spoke to both the 3-year-old, who's obviously much older now, and Betty, who has since passed, but not before speaking to Eli Frankel. So, you're gonna get things in, Sisters in Death, obviously, that you have never heard before about the Black Dahlia. Now, at the beginning, I'm curious about, you take a lot of care to, sort of frame Elizabeth Short as, for lack of a better way to say it, I guess the kind of the most important figure in this entire narrative, which is,
Yeah.
Makes sense because she is the quote unquote Black Dahlia. What do we know about Elizabeth Short? I mean, she's always described as a Hollywood actress. Had she actually appeared in stuff? And you also called her at the top the most maligned victim that you've ever, come across, or that others have come across in true crime. Why was she so, I guess, mistreated in terms of her status as a victim in this case?
Yeah. So, as I said before, one of the central goals I set out for myself when I was like, okay, are you going to spend this much time researching this case, hoping you find new things or discovering things? Was at the very least, I want to understand who Elizabeth Short was and to bring her to life in a way. For us to try to understand her, not as the Black Dahlia, which obviously she wasn't, and also not as a victim, because every time you label somebody a victim, you're trying to learn who they were, what their life was, what their mindset was. You're always going to see everything you discover through the lens of what eventually happens to her. I wanted to get to know her as a 22-year-old woman. What was she really like? What was it like to spend an hour with her? And I was able to kind of piece together a picture of that using, kind of hundreds of different sources, testimony of people she knew, letters from and to her family, reports in the newspapers about things she had told people, and then firsthand accounts of people who had known her or folks who had been kind of tangentially associated with her. It was like this research project about her as a person, because I feel like so much over the years in so many books and podcasts and articles, she's almost an afterthought. Everybody sort of repeats the same facts about her, the same 7 or 8 pages about what we know about her. But there's been so little curiosity about who she was as a person. And what I discovered is actually a lot of really admirable traits. I think her story is kind of amazing. Put the murder aside, like the bravery it took to get on a bus and travel across the country to states you had never been to, kind of exploring the world and taking it on its own. I really, I couldn't have done that at 22 years old with no money in my pocket.
Where was she from originally?
So she was born and raised in Medford, Massachusetts, Hyde Park as well, but Medford, Massachusetts, which was a really poor working class town during the Depression. And I won't go into too much detail about her origin story, but her dad ended up faking his own suicide. The family was left destitute. The mom had to go work for Liberty Mutual, taking care of 5 daughters. And then eventually, years later, he pops up and writes a letter to the family and says, "Hey, I'm alive. I'm sorry. Can we patch things up?" And the 4 sisters and the mom, Phoebe, say no way. But Elizabeth, the 5th sister, actually takes him up on the offer. And he gives her the bus money to go out to Vallejo, California and meet him out there. And she thinks, this is great. I'm finally going to get reunited with my dad who's been gone for so long. And this is terrific. And she shows up there and he ends up essentially putting her to work cooking and cleaning. And when she doesn't want to all day long, he gets upset and eventually throws her out. So it's sad. She was really abandoned twice by her father, but she had a great family. Her mom really loved her, and she sent letters to her every week, never complaining about the tough circumstances she was in when she was in California. But in terms of like the maligning of her character, first of all, she was never an actor. She never sought any roles. She never auditioned.
Mm.
She never tried to hook up with directors or producers and talk to them about, her aspirations. There's no evidence that she ever tried to do anything in Hollywood or be on screen. She had no interest in that. And the truth was that really what she was looking for when she was out in California was the same thing she'd been looking for in the years since the kind of fallout with her dad, which was she was looking for love. She was looking for someone who would take care of her, that she could take care of, someone that, she could spend the rest of her life with and feel protected and safe. Because I think she had had a life that had no protection, no safety. And, she wanted what all of us wanted. And in many ways, she's just like us, which, of course, is why a lot of that maligning continued, because when about 2 or 3 weeks after it became clear the police were going to have real trouble solving this thing, and the folks of Los Angeles are absolutely freaked out and panicking about this madman on the loose who could potentially do it again, you see this change in the media where all of a sudden she's not this sweet 22-year-old girl who had come to visit Los Angeles for a few months. She became the Black Dahlia, a vampiress, a party girl, a denizen of the night, kind of traipsing into weird, obscure Hollywood clubs and hanging out with mobsters and desperate to get roles in Hollywood and drinking, smoking, doing drugs, possibly prostitution. They turned her into this dark figure. And a lot of those myths are still repeated today. Even this idea that she was constantly chiseling men for dates and drinks and dinners. And then as soon as they try to kiss her or whatever, she'd disappear, that she was sort of a con artist and she lied to everybody. And myriad other myths.
Yeah. It's fascinating. This is the first I'm hearing of this. I'd always thought she was actually, which is why I asked you what kind of role she had. I always thought that she was out there trying to make a career of it. LA, maybe not the best place to find true love for anyone else looking for love in all the wrong places. But take us to January 9th. That's the day I believe she's last seen alive. Obviously, anytime you're talking a murder and you're talking to investigators, it is the timeline that is most important. So what do we know about her last moments when she is seen for the final minutes before she then goes and disappears on that day?
Right. So that's always been at the heart of the mystery, the enigma of this case, is why did she return to Los Angeles from San Diego on January 9th? Who was she waiting for at the ritzy Biltmore Hotel lobby for 3 hours while she was there? And then who did she go off with? And where was she for 6 days until her body was found on January 15th? This missing week of 6 days. Now, there have been tons of reports over the years from various people, especially back in the late 1940s, that they had seen her here, seen her there, all over town. People were calling in saying, I saw the Black Dahlia on January 10th or January 12th or whatever it was, none of which the LAPD could verify. Now, there's been lots of speculation about where she was during that week, why she had gone to San Diego, but nobody really knows, and that's really at the heart of the mystery. But to me, the answer ultimately wasn't going to be with the LAPD or some suspect. The answer, I thought, was going to be with Beth Short herself. And I thought, we've done so little. We've listened to everybody in this case except for her. And we need to, if we want to understand where she was going and why aren't we listening to her? So I started going through the correspondence, the letters she sent, the letters she didn't send that were in her luggage and her suitcases that the police later found, kind of scouring for clues. And it's so plain. It was right there in front of us the whole time. She explains to this kind of off again, on again boyfriend she was sort of campaigning to get back with, but he was kind of pushing her away. He had moved back east. And in December of 1946, when she's down in San Diego, she at first tells him that she starts to hate LA. It's not an unusual thing. A lot of people do.
Yeah.
After a while, though, you also come back to love it. It's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But she started corresponding with him, and it's very plain from her letters that she is not going back to LA. She does not like it there. She met a couple guys that scared her. She's over. She says, the weather was warm, but the people are cold. She wants to leave. That's her game plan. And she at first tells him she's going to be in Florida, so write me there, right? You got addresses back there, there's no cell phones. So they've been corresponding with letters. He's writing her in San Diego. And then in late December, early January, she changes her mind. And she tells him, I'm actually moving back to Chicago. She had been in Chicago in the summer of 1946, and she tells him, that's where I'm going. She's going to do some hat modeling the way she had done before, but she wants to go back to Chicago. I thought that was rather interesting. And why is she telling him this? Well, I looked into what was going on with him and his career at the time. He was a pilot in the Army, actually, during the war, not the Air Force. And he had gotten a job for 20th Century Airlines in Charlotte, North Carolina, his hometown. And his route took him several times a week directly to Chicago. So it's very obvious that she's putting herself in a position where they can meet up and rekindle this relationship, which she's been pushing on. Again, it's like, let's not think of this and try to figure out what she's doing and where she's going and who she's with through the lens of like some exotic Black Dahlia. Let's look at it through the lens of a 22-year-old woman who really likes this guy, which all of us, have been in that situation. You're trying to either get back together with an ex, or you're trying to, get somebody interested in you, and, oh, I'm going to be there too at that time. Like, these folks aren't different from us. So let's humanize them and look at them in the same way that we would be approaching a situation like this. So when she returns to Los Angeles on January 9th, 1947, it's obvious what she's doing and why she tells her ride, her escort, to drop her off at Greyhound bus station. Because the only buses to Chicago from Southern California leave from the Greyhound bus station in downtown Los Angeles. That's where she was going. The one thing she didn't have was the money to buy a ticket, which was expensive back then. And so her waiting at the Biltmore Hotel a few blocks away, having changed completely for a night out on the town, was in order to wait for the person that she had contacted to get the money to get that bus ticket. All these pieces begin to fall into place, and a lot more.
So is that who you presume is the killer, the person she's
Correct.
contacted? Okay.
Yeah.
I got to take again a third of a step back this time.
Sure.
I'm asking this question not to out you here, but give me what are one or two of your biggest shows that you've produced on TV?
Oh, wow. I've worked on Survivor, Amazing Race.
They're big. That's my point.
Yeah.
So Eli Frankel's a big time TV producer. The amount of research that was involved in this is staggering. I mean, the details that you're talking about here, finding these correspondences. I'm just curious, like what the writing process was like. How long did this take you? And we'll get back to the story because there's a whole other half of this. But how long did this take you in total? I mean, getting the quote unquote, the so to speak receipts, the information that you needed, and then putting the receipts down on paper, your thoughts on paper, and creating that. I mean, this is something that a person could spend a lifetime just working on this one story.
Yeah, totally. It's hard to say exactly what the length of time was because there were stops and starts. There was working late at night or the weekends.
Yeah.
And then there were, full weeks that go by where it was just like my job, right? So it's hard to tell, but it was a lot. I mean, I've been reading, everything about the case for 20 years. And so I went in, I think, with a pretty good kind of breadth knowledge of it. But the research, which was really intense, and I had to fly all over the country and spend like days in these archives, in the basement going through papers and like not being able to breathe because of the dust. But honestly, like I love that stuff because you're the only person who's gone through these boxes in years, and so you might find those gems that nobody else has seen before. There was a lot of that, but I also, like I said, I love it. The writing of the actual book itself was probably like 8 months, just once the research was done, and it was a full time job. Like that was 8 months of 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, or whatever. But the
With a wife and kids, I might
yeah,
add. So kudos to you, man. And I went through that, and you kind of just have to shut the world off.
yeah.
I just put on headphones and tune the world out and just write,
Did,
which I'm about to do
did
again.
your did your wife and kids think you were absolutely crazy for trying to write a book?
They didn't understand it. I don't think anyone did. But unlike you, I mean, my book was not research intensive. It was in the sense that I had to speak to my mother, but it wasn't like what you're doing, which I couldn't. I have no, for full disclosure, no patience to sit and study. And I mean, you're really like, you're essentially you're no different than a detective working this case, which is phenomenal. And just goes to show your dedication to this story. Mine was, more talking to my mom and then just putting
Yeah, but
words
your
down.
story was also really heavy and emotional, and
Yeah,
that has its own burden and emotional heft. So dude, I respect the hell out of your book and what you've done.
yeah. Anyone who can can sit down and write a book, it is not an easy endeavor. So I guess kudos. I'll take kudos to both of us on that one. By the way, again, not to put you on the spot, but I'm always curious about these things. Do you happen to know the price for that one-way ticket to Chicago from LA in
Yep.
19 yeah, how much is it? Was it?
$30.85, which is the equivalent of like $530 today. I mean, you think it's expensive traveling today. That's on a bus over 3 days, right? And but no cell phone, not even a Walkman to listen to music, and you're going through the desert in the 1940s on a Greyhound. I mean, holy, $500 for
Yeah.
that? It's crazy.
It must have been super cool back then. You had newspapers. Another question before so now there's a whole second half of this
Mhm.
story, which is the prairie heirs we're gonna get to, but I'm just curious, is there still like a locker somewhere in the LAPD? Do they collect evidence? If one day they're able to connect this via DNA, is there something with DNA on it to try to connect it?
Yeah, so what I discovered is there's actually a whole story about what happened to the files and the evidence afterwards as well.
Hmm.
I mean, there's so many different aspects of the story. So this case also was passed down, which happens with cold cases, but especially with a big one like this. It was passed down from a generation of detectives to the next detective, and there's still somebody today at LAPD who has the case is theirs, and they're really more there to field calls from people who are like, I found photos in grandpa's attic and I think they're related to the Black Dahlia. Well, this is the person that the LAPD has assigned to look at anything like that. And I actually talked to a couple of the guys who had possession of the case in the 70s and 80s. And what happened was, there was a ton of physical evidence, including the killer sent in Elizabeth Short's address book and birth certificate and a bunch of other documents of hers to the newspapers, and constructed an envelope himself with crazy quilt lettering cut out of newspapers and glued to the front of the envelope. There were a few other correspondences as well. There was quite a bit of evidence that was collected in the case. And then the documentation, the police reports, the witness statements, all that stuff was enormous. I mean, it was thousands and thousands of pages long, and they didn't even get around to categorizing it all until 1949, and it took them months to put it all together and have like this essentially analog database for everything that could be cross-referenced and checked with this file and that witness statement. It was amazing what they put together. But what happened over the decades is internally at LAPD, the case was, as cold as ice. It's probably never going to get solved. And so little pieces of evidence began disappearing from within. People would take something home. And it's like, oh my God, this was owned by Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. And little pieces begin to disappear. And then there were 3 file cabinets filled with all of these documents, which, are absolute gold. They're treasure. This is all the original documents from the investigation. And over the years, they were sort of dispersed to different departments. Then people tried to get him back. And then Harry Hansen, the lead detective in the mid 70s, was helping out as a consultant on a TV movie about the Black Dahlia, and took a bunch of the files with him, and they were never returned. And so there's about a third of the files remain at LAPD. They're actually in like a captain's or lieutenant's office, which never happens. They're usually sent to city archives or, put in one of their warehouses, but they're actually on premises apparently. And a bunch of, there's a few thousand pages left, but nowhere near what was originally there.
Wow. That's fascinating and also, nightmarish to think that people are taking
Yeah.
bits and pieces of the evidence. This case could still be solved one day, particularly now with investigative genetic genealogy. But so now there's Layla Welsh,
Yep.
totally different woman. Who is she? And why is this story so important to the Black Dahlia?
Yeah. So about 2 or 3 weeks after Elizabeth Short was murdered, when the LAPD is at their absolute height, they've got hundreds of investigators from not just LAPD, but the Sheriff's Department, California State Patrol, a myriad different agencies from around the state are trying to help, including the FBI. The FBI didn't get too involved, but they technologically helped out with lab stuff. It was an enormous case, and they were able to put together a timeline of Elizabeth Short's movements and exactly who she was with and where, but there was a missing gap of 3 days, literally right before she escapes to San Diego a month before her murder. On December 9th, 1946, she leaves at midnight for San Diego on a 6 or 7 hour bus ride, a city that she had never been to nor ever knew anybody in. And it's a big mystery in the story as to why she went down there, because she essentially shows up homeless and she has no place to stay and she doesn't know anybody. So it very much appears that she was kind of desperately trying to leave Los Angeles in the cover of night. She's gone from LA for a month, and then of course she returns on the night of January 9th, and then she disappears about 4 hours after she returns to Los Angeles. So the big question for the police was, where was she in this missing 3 days right before she leaves for San Diego? They couldn't find evidence of anybody that had spoken to her or been in contact with her or had seen her in those 3 days. Finally, they were able to identify the guy she was with. And right off the bat, they questioned him, and he told them myriad lies about what he was doing with her, where he was, and the amount and the length of time that he had spent with her. Right away, they knew it wasn't a day he had spent with her. He was with her for 3 days. The place he said he deposited her had no proof that they ever were there. So right away, they detected this guy is obviously trying to hide something. So they look into this man's past because he seems really suspect. And what they discover is a woman, a 24-year-old woman in 1941, was murdered in Kansas City, his hometown and where he had grown up and where he had been living up until then. A woman was murdered in a brutal fashion that had strikingly similar circumstances to the murder of Elizabeth Short. There were some indications that they were kind of very, very similar. Some things that had been done that had never been seen before with Elizabeth Short, similar things were done in this murder. And the thing that really got the police's alarm going was the fact that this suspect had gone to college with her just a few years before. Her name was Layla Welsh. She was the heiress to a Kansas City real estate fortune, even though her family actually lived very humbly. And she was, like I said, she was murdered in 1941, and she had apparently gone to school with the suspect. So the LAPD dives in and contacts Kansas City Police Department and asks for them to send over everything they have on this case, this murder of Layla Welsh, who was killed in her home at 3 a.m. and with her mother and her brother asleep 15 feet away in other rooms. It was a horrific bloodletting. It was a horrific mutilation. They know some kind of the headlines of this murder, but they don't know the details. And so Kansas City Police Department tells LAPD, sure, yeah, we'll send over the files on this suspect and also that murder that occurred 6 years ago. And then the files never came. And then LAPD requested again 6 months later, and the files never came. And over again. The Kansas City Police Department just never sent them over. And so the LAPD was sort of hobbled in their investigation. But along the way, as they had this suspect in their sights and continued to, and in fact, he topped the list of the suspects that the district attorney and LAPD were looking into, even into the 1950s when they had eliminated 300 suspects. There were a handful of names that they could not eliminate, that they were absolutely fixated on. And they had good reason to fixate on this suspect because there were certain things that were found on her body that linked directly to him and his occupation. And all those things are revealed in the book as well. So the LAPD had this guy in their sights, but they never had enough evidence, specifically from the Leila Welsh murder, to prove that there were enough similarities that it was likely the same hand behind these two murders.
Wow. Let me stop you right there. So, if I'm reading this correctly, I completely buried the lead. It appears that you through your research may have solved the murder of the Black Dahlia here. But let me ask you a couple. Is that fair to say, by the way?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Eli Frankel could possibly have figured out this decades-old murder mystery, and in his book, Sisters in Death, he will reveal who this killer is. Now, let me just ask you, 'cause I don't want you to I assume you know the name of this suspect. Back in the day, did the LAPD, did they have a name? Did they know where this person was when they were contacting Kansas City?
Yeah, absolutely. And his name was Carl Balsiger. Now,
Okay.
the book is going to go into detail for you about his life, who he was, all the myriad strange things that kind of
Mm.
point to a pretty sociopathic and possibly psychopathic personality. I was able to discover a lot of kind of skeletons, if you will, in his closet. And then I went into detail about the murder of Leila Welsh. And I was able to determine with certainty something that the LAPD just never had enough info to determine, which was that not only did he know Leila Welsh, but he was in proximity and around her for 10 years. Their lives overlapped in myriad ways. Like they were always kind of within close proximity of each other. It's very clear that he was aware of her and watching her for many years. And at the University of Kansas, at UKC, the University of Kansas City at that time, they were not only in school together, but they all shared the same social circle. They were all at the same events. They were at the same dances. They were on the same school boards. They both attended the same church with their families. They both went to the same lake house, small lake house community that was 30 miles outside of Kansas City, and tons of other overlap throughout their lives. They had grown up in a pretty elite circle in Kansas City, lived just blocks from each other, and were, much more than just acquaintances.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to Leela's murder as well as, Elizabeth, Beth Short, they were, I think, both bisected, right? They're both cut in half, at least Short was. So, what do we know about Balsiger's, his either his career, what he did for a living, or his abilities to be able to do something like this?
Yeah, I mean, the book details again, like his career and how
Mhm.
it also dovetails with the saga of Elizabeth Short and where he really took her during those 3 missing days in December of 1946, a month before she's murdered, and why he went there and where she was staying in Los Angeles at his home, where the real location of the home and where I believe she was also murdered, which the LAPD was never able to determine what that location was. So the whole picture will be painted of where this was, where it took place, and essentially how he pulled it off.
And
But
at one point, I think Leela, Welsh's brother,
yeah,
was a potential suspect, and I think you made it, a point in, Sisters in Death to clear that up, that he in fact wasn't a suspect? I mean, to this day, is he still discussed as a possible suspect?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, just a little bit of background here in terms of the murder of Leela Welsh. This is a really beautiful, graceful, highly intelligent, highly educated, and strangely universally loved 24-year-old woman, right? I mean, everybody that came into contact with her kind of just thought the world of her. And even though she's an heiress, she's going to have plenty of money later on. She and her family live modestly. They live in a small kind of middle class home, very tight homes on either side. And one night she's coming home from the circus with her boyfriend, who drops her off at her home at 1:30 a.m. She goes into this small home, kisses her mother goodnight, goes into her own room, closes the door, washes up for the evening, for the night, and then goes to sleep in her bed. So this is around 2 a.m. Approximately 3 a.m., her mother, Marie Welsh, is woken out of bed when she hears two thuds somewhere in the house, deep thuds. She walks out of her bedroom, goes in the living room, notices the light is still on and her son is asleep on the couch, turns the light off, and walks into her room. What she doesn't realize is those two thuds were the result of a 4.5-pound, what's called a railroad track hammer, the kind of hammers you use to drive in stakes in railroads, had been used to smash her daughter's skull. Somebody had been waiting outside in the backyard, looking into Leela Welsh's bedroom for hours. They've been waiting for her to return. It's 31 degrees. It's freezing out. There's a light dusting of snow and mud on the ground. And that person lay in wait under a tree, holding a satchel, essentially, kind of bound together with t-shirts and cloth, of implements of murder: razor blades, butcher's knives, a two-tine carving fork, like the kind you use at Thanksgiving to hold the turkey when you're cutting the turkey, the hammer, and some other tools as well. He was wearing gloves, and he was very well prepared for what he had planned to do. After she fell asleep, he slipped through her open window, tiptoed towards her bed, raised the hammer, and then brought it down on her skull twice, thus waking Marie Welsh and waking one of the neighbor's kids that was reported the next day. He then proceeds to use a butcher knife to cut a V-shaped opening in her neck, starting from near the ear down to the center, so 2 points that come down and meet at the center of the bottom of her neck, which obviously, there was an enormous amount of blood flowing out of there. He used a white t-shirt rag to stanch the bleeding, to keep it from spraying on him, and then watched her bleed out for 45 minutes to an hour. So he was essentially exsanguinating her. Now, one of the things he was doing when he cut her throat is he tried, as you pointed out, to sever her head from her body. And he was successful in actually cutting off nearly the entire head, but he couldn't get the spinal column completely severed. And they found notches in the bones there in the spinal column that showed where he had been punching it with that butcher knife, trying to dislodge the bones there in the spinal column, but was unsuccessful. So his goal was essentially to sever that body. Nonetheless, he waited for an hour for the blood to flow out and then proceeded to carve a 1 pound, 1 inch thick, I'm sorry, not 1 pound, a 1 inch thick, 1 pound piece of flesh that was about 4.5 inches in diameter from her thigh. Okay, so imagine he takes a razor blade and in one smooth arc carves out and tears out a 1 inch thick, 4.5 inch diameter, horseshoe shaped piece of flesh from her thigh that includes the skin, the fat and subcutaneous tissue, and muscle underneath it. That's why it's 1 inch thick. And some other mutilations as well. And then finally, he signs some kind of weird signature on her ankle using a bloodied fingerprint, right? He dips his finger in, he's still wearing a glove, but he's dipping his finger in blood, and he makes a bizarre mark that was described as either a G or an S. And I think I have a sense of what that would have looked like. So he and he leaves the ankle exposed, but he pulls the bed cover over her head, essentially trying to hide her in a way. And then he escapes. And what's interesting is, and this is one of the most bizarre aspects of the murder, he leaves a trail of evidence behind. Usually a killer wants to take everything with them because any piece of evidence can lead to your own capture. Instead, he stabs the butcher knife into the ground right outside her bedroom window. And then, in the subsequent blocks throughout the backyards away from her home, deposits all of the evidence, including the piece of flesh. And the cops were never able to determine why he would have left so much behind. And just to make this point, with Elizabeth Short, and this is why the LAPD thought, there could be a connection here. Out of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia's thigh, was carved a 1-inch thick, 1 pound, 4.5, 5-inch diameter, horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh that was comprised of skin, subcutaneous tissue and fat, and muscle. It's literally the same piece of flesh carved out, and that also was left behind by the killer within her own body. So this is a killer who carves out the same piece of flesh and then leaves it behind for the cops to find.
Which we all know serial killers, they've got these hallmarks of their murders, and that appears to possibly be the situation here. What I'm amazed by is he was in Leila Welsh's home, in her room for what, an hour that night doing this?
Probably.
Wow.
Yeah.
And who else was home? Her mother? Who was in
Yeah.
that house at the time?
Yeah, so her mother and her brother's asleep on the sofa in the living room, which, by the way, very small home, right? Like, it's one of these old school 1920s homes that's like, built for lower middle class neighborhoods, people who are, it's probably their first home. It's 1920, right?
Yeah.
So these are, have you ever been in one of those houses? It's very small, kind of classic traditional American, neighborhoods that were built quickly in the 1920s, but they're beautiful homes. But her mother is asleep. The only thing that separates her from her mother's room is a very thin bathroom, or a very, tight bathroom. So a few feet, and then, right over there is her mom asleep in her room. Her brother was probably 20 feet away on the sofa. Her door was closed. There wasn't a lock on it. And in fact, the killer put a chair that was in Leila's room that had a broken back under the doorknob for her door in order to try and stop it from opening, which didn't stop it from being open. Her mom walked in just fine the next morning when she found the body. But he was definitely in there for at least an hour and a half, because when you look at the timing of everything he did, how long he waited. And then there's bizarre things, like on his way out, he pulled down the curtains and the drapes and then proceeded to fold them and place them on the windowsill. They were described as being folded like you would a formal napkin on a formal dining table, right, with the pleats and the folds. He took the time to do that while he's standing outside the window, right, because he's placing on the windowsill. You can't step over it. So we know he's outside when he does this, and he's pleating the curtains that he's pulled down, and then stabs the knife into the backyard, into the dirt there right outside her window. It's really, really bizarre. So imagine, though, for a second here, this guy is in there, and this window is very exposed to the neighborhood. The police counted 36 windows alone from neighbors' houses that could look directly into that window. Wow. That's how tight the homes are there. And that's how tolerant of risk this killer was. But what's really interesting to me is the most amount of time he would have spent in that hour and a half, at least in that room, is the draining of blood. It's going to take 30, 45 minutes for most of that blood to drain out. And what's interesting here is another parallel with the Elizabeth Short murder. He, as you stated before, he exsanguinated her. He drained her body of blood because when he made the excisions, when he cut out the pieces of flesh, like the horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh from her thigh, he didn't want any blood in there. And that he didn't want blood flowing out of it. This is a killer who is blood averse. And the police were astounded by that. that the cavity in Elizabeth Short's thigh was completely free of blood. It was just like this missing puzzle piece of flesh, this horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh that was missing from her leg. And the same circumstance is found with Leila Welsh. There was no blood in that cavity. And when you read the police reports, they're literally almost word for word the exact same description of that wound.
Wow. Now, in the same way that in theory, Elizabeth Short's evidence is supposed to be kept in sort of pristine fashion, which we have learned is not the case. Has Kansas City PD, have they held on to Leila's evidence? Is that still accessible?
Well, part of it is, that's the good thing, is that I think they've been more forthcoming over the years than, and certainly for me, that they've been more forthcoming than LAPD has. I mean, LAPD essentially is a vault when it comes to Black Dahlia. It doesn't seem like they're ever going to release the files that remain or discuss it or, go through kind of theories or anything like that. I mean, they're obviously pretty busy with the city, but they've determined that it's just, not worth engaging in. Kansas City has been definitely with me was a little more open in terms of sharing information. But what was interesting too is that, at the time, newspaper reporters were everywhere, right? Like there were hundreds of them in Los Angeles alone, and so many reporters in Kansas City at the time. And I mean, they were embedded with the cops everywhere back then. They were kind of given free reign in at the stations and at headquarters, and they would do ride-alongs. They would talk to the cops would slip them pieces of information. So it was remarkable how much detail and info was in all the newspapers back then as well. You have to find it, and it's not all online. Like I said, it requires a lot of searching through dusty boxes and basements and stuff. But KCPD is actually a pretty open organization. And
Do we know why they never sent LA the requested files?
No. And I've spoken with a couple of people who have their theories. Some of them are a little more kind of conspiratorial, though they may be right. But Carl Balsiger's father was a really influential businessman in Kansas City. He was a top executive at what was known as Schulze Bakery and then Interstate Bakeries, which later became Hostess Brands, right? Huge company.
Twinkies.
Yeah. And that corporation was enormous, and he was a top executive. He had a lot of power in that city, and he also had a very close relationship with KCPD. He had worked with them before. The book kind of explains some of what he had done. He sat on police and fire commissions. So, whether he had gotten them to kind of lay off or something or not cooperate, we don't know. But the book goes through some ideas of why that might have been, or it was a very embarrassing case in many ways for the city because it was never solved. And there's a great part of the story that the book goes into that shows how politics really took over and kind of derailed that case. George Welsh, the brother of Leila Welsh, was kind of railroaded into becoming the patsy for this thing. He was never, there was never real evidence against him, but they tried to destroy him and they tried to pin the murder on him. And I think that in many ways, the city just wanted to move past that. But nonetheless, when you've got a police force like, the homicide division at LAPD telling you they need these documents, you send them over, even in the 1940s. I mean, that's really bad form. So, who knows? But there's probably an interesting story to be found there as well.
Yeah. Two more quick questions and we'll wrap it up. And I'm going to encourage everybody to buy and read Sisters in Death. I mean, Carl Balsiger is this guy that we're talking about who could potentially be the killer. Whatever happened with him? What happened to him after the murders? And what do we know?
It gets real interesting. And in fact, it got real interesting before the murders too. The book talks about the mysterious drowning of his 7-year-old sister when he was 12 years old, and the circumstances around that, very, very mysterious. And then afterwards, there's a really fascinating saga about this guy, including an absolutely insane stalking incident when he's in his 40s. He ends up stalking the entire management company that manages the apartment building he's living in, including their agents, their lawyers. I mean, night after night of, peeping Tom and leaving things for them. Really bizarre behavior. His escape to Bermuda to the Bahamas in the late 1960s, and then getting thrown out of there for having gotten into some trouble. What was he was up to in his later years, crisscrossing the northern Midwest. There's a lot of pretty interesting aspects to this guy that I think point to the mindset that would have been absolutely capable of these murders.
Any other exsanguination murders that are unsolved that you know of that have the hallmarks of what was left behind with both Leela and Elizabeth?
No, and that's what's interesting is that there's so many other parallels and similarities between these murders that is in the book as well. But specifically, the whole horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh, the draining of blood before cutting out pieces of the flesh, leaving these things behind, and so much more. I haven't found any evidence of something similar to this. Now, exsanguination happens. Unfortunately, it's not totally unusual, though it is unusual. But then also to use exsanguination as a way of getting rid of blood within the body so that then the killer can cut pieces of flesh out, bloodless pieces of flesh, is really, really unique. And then on top of that, in both cases, a killer that is purposely leaving behind evidence that overwhelms the police and actually ends up helping the killer is just another shared similarity between these two murders that you just never see.
This is an absolutely fascinating conversation. It also renews my hope that we're not just depraved in 2025, but man has always been depraved. This is why we should like dogs more than people. This is the book. It is Sisters in Death, the Black Dahlia, the Prairie Heiress, and their Hunter by Eli Frankel, a good friend and famous Hollywood TV producer. You've seen his stuff before. Um, Eli, where do people find the book? I think today it is October 28th, I believe, is publication day. So big mazel tov to you, big milestone. Where do we get this book besides Jeff Bezos's little company?
Well, pretty much anywhere you get your books, barnesandnobles.com. I mean, every major bookseller, and it's in bookstores as well. And obviously Jeff Bezos and Amazon have it available for you as well. But I mean, anywhere you go to get books, online or in person, it's probably there.
Yeah, and I mean, outside of the fact, that it appears that Eli may have solved this case. Um, Give us your elevator pitch as to why this is different than all the other Black Dahlia stuff. I mean, this sounds like a must read. It also sounds like it could potentially be solved now through what I was talking about earlier, IGG. If we know the victims, we know the potential suspect. Is that the next step here in your final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what's different here is that there is a huge body of evidence that's being presented that's never been presented before. It's all based on fact. It's not conjecture. It's not rumor. It's not wishful thinking. And it's all those facts kind of present a very new picture into this story, including a lot of testimony from people who had been involved with the case or their kids, who had stories to tell and photos to share from the case that had never been contacted before. And I think what's really important here to mention too is that, this is the first serious suspect that's been presented that was verified to have known and been with Elizabeth Short, has the motive, means, and opportunity to do this. Every other suspect that's ever been discussed, again, because we're seeing it through the lens of this kind of Marvel supervillain left the body out for the world to be shocked. Now knowing that that's not the case, this is the only suspect that we absolutely know was with her and had contact with her, and she knew. All these other suspects that were originally presented by the LAPD and have been focused on by other folks or new names that have come in. There's not a shred of evidence they were ever in proximity with Elizabeth Short. They ever knew her or came across her. And that's really important because no matter what you present, if there was never any opportunity for her to come across them, then they can't be the killer.
Again, absolutely fascinating. The book here, I'll hold it up, cool cover too. Sisters in Death, the Black Dahlia, the Prairie Heiress, and the Hunter. And Eli may have hunted the hunter himself. So time's going to tell if we have in fact solved this case. Thanks to Eli Frankel. Awesome to talk to you. Love you, America. Love you, LA. And justice for Leela and Elizabeth here all these years later. It is never too late. Eli, stick around 1 second.